Holder is a research project manager, beef nutrition with Alltech. He received his bachelor's degree in animal science from the University of Victoria in 2004. In 2005, he completed a research internship at Alltech's North American Bioscience Center in Nicholasville, Kentucky, where his research focused on the effects of various yeast culture strains on the growth of select rumen microorganisms in vitro. In 2007, Holder received his master's degree in ruminant nutrition and microbiology from the University of Victoria. He then returned to the US for his PhD in ruminant nutrition, which he received from the University of Kentucky in 2012. In August 2012, Holder joined Alltech in the postdoctoral traineeship position with a focus on advanced technical support in ruminant protein nutrition. And in October 2013, Holder was transferred to Alltech's South African offices in Stellenbosch as a national research and technical director. In 2015, Holder returned to Alltech's research headquarters in Nicholasville, where he now heads global nutritional research in beef species. Welcome, Dr. Holder.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. That's quite the long intro. I haven't heard my life story read back to me. But I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here, particularly since I get to speak on a topic where I have a lot of passion and a lot of excitement for. I think that you folks as well have share the same excitement in this area of livestock agriculture. So if I can just confirm with someone who's not muted that you can see my slides, I'll get moving along with it. I'll launch it.
Thank you.
Okay, good. So talk about this livestock and climate. I think it's really important that we position this topic within the context of what we're doing here. You know, a lot of people like to talk about the methane emissions coming out of ruminant livestock, but they don't talk about it in the context of what they are doing for us as well. So I think it's important as we consider whether livestock should be a part of our food systems in the future, what the status of those food systems are and what the contribution of livestock are, because it's important that we frame that discussion, I believe. So when I talk about livestock in this conversation, I'm talking about livestock in general, but ruminants in particular. And in most cases, because there's not a lot of sheep research available in this space, we're going to put dairy cattle and beef cattle research as a placeholder for that, even though I am suspicious that sheep research might have even better, or sheep production might have even better environmental credentials than cattle production. But don't tell my beef people that I actually said that. So as I said, I think it's important that we start this conversation discussing where we are, right? I think that you see the UN talking about food security and food systems, and they talk about where we are at the moment and the fact that we have to produce so much food by the year 2050 that we don't know how we're going to do it. And I think that it's really important that we step back and we look at this food sufficiency calculation that we're doing, because if you look at Paul Moen's work, this is a researcher out of New Zealand, he went in and looked at the UN databases and what food sufficiency actually looks like, in this case, in particular looking at protein. And what he found was that when you go in and you correct their databases, which are reported in essentially crude protein, any nutritionists out there know that crude protein or gross protein has to be corrected for digestibility and amino acid composition before we know how much of that protein we can actually use as humans. When you correct those databases for the digestibility or poor digestibility of plant-based proteins, and the poor amino acid composition of plant-based proteins, we have a fairly different story when we talk about food security or protein security in this case. So I think that, let me make sure I can get a pointer here. Can you guys see that pointer? So this is 190 something territories and countries that we have in the world, and you can see the food sufficiency or the amount of protein that we're actually eating and the food sufficiency line. And you might think to yourself, well, we've only got a handful of countries there where we don't have enough protein. And so as a world, we're doing pretty well, because if we can shift some of the extra food from here to there, we'll be in good shape. But that's not really the whole story, right? So when you correct that original data set, this is the same data set here in frame number A on the left. basically just chopping off the first 103 countries, the 103 countries that have the lowest protein availability. You correct that data set for the digestibility of those plant proteins, and all of a sudden you have about 2/3 of that data set that is now falling on average, so this is average population protein intakes, falling below that line. You correct that for the amino acid profile of the plant protein that those nations are eating, and you have 103 out of 190 something countries in the world that on average are protein insufficient now. Not 2050, now, half the world. That is really, really important as we frame the discussion about what are we going to do to agriculture in the future. It's an entitled conversation of the first world countries, right? We are all going to decide which way agriculture is moving in the world. We have to know about this stuff when we're having that conversation. That conversation also applies to how we measure the sustainability credentials of food production. In other words, you get folks that are talking about the greenhouse gas metrics or the freshwater use or whatever it might be of all kinds of food products, but these are often reported in per ton of food produced or sometimes per ton of protein produced, right? But that again is not the most important metric as we try to feed populations of people. When you correct things like land use, freshwater use, and greenhouse gas production for the digestibility and amino acid composition of those products, you start telling a little bit of a different story. You look at land use, for instance, and you see why a lot of people gravitate towards grains as the base of our food pyramid, why we should do that. Because in terms of land and the amount of protein we can make, they're pretty efficient. However, you correct those for the amount of digestible protein, in this case, digestible lysine being most limiting. You can see that it essentially evens the playing field here. Even though wheat, rice, and maize are being grown on arable land and the production of these animals is not being done on arable land. But it certainly evens the playing field. When you talk about fresh water use, it essentially flips the narrative completely. Wheat, rice, and maize go from having the smallest water use to having the highest water use. And milk has the lowest water use across those things. So it's really important when we consider environmental credentials of things to consider these things. Greenhouse gas, the one that everyone talks about all the time, essentially goes from being a very, very strong case to be made for putting grains at the base of our diet to, well, rice and maize have a greater greenhouse gas footprint than eggs and pork. Now, one thing that's missing in this greenhouse gas calculation, as you can see, milk is higher because dairy animals produce methane, right? And that's the reason why milk is higher. One thing that is not considered here is that this is greenhouse gas, CO2 equivalents, according to the GWP 100 method, right? And that does not account for the fact that methane has a short half-life and disappears in about 12 years. So it treats methane essentially as if it's a permanent gas, when in which case it would act like this. We know now from all of the work that has been done principally at the University of Oxford that is no longer the case, and we need to reconsider how we talk about greenhouse gases. But that's just protein, right? And we can do this for a number of nutrients, but I find it quite interesting when you go in and you look at a combination of nutrients, particularly when you're looking at things that humans are particularly or commonly deficient in. This work was done by Ty Beal quite recently here. And basically what he did is said, what is the greenhouse gas footprint of getting, in this case, 1/3 of your typical adult recommendation of iron, zinc, calcium, folate, vitamin A, and B12, right? From either refined grains or all sorts of other products. The greenhouse gas footprint of getting those nutrients from grains, whole grains, refined grains, is massive compared to animal products because of the nutritional density of animal products. We know this, but it's something that needs to be considered as we talk about the environmental credentials of what we're doing. Liver is the most nutritionally dense food on the earth. And you can see as a result has an extremely small carbon footprint when it goes for supplying a certain panel of nutrients. So everyone can manipulate the data to fit their narrative, right? Yeah, I'm just going to point out that lamb and mutton is better than beef, just for you guys. But it's important that we think about the context when we talk about these things, because the context is that as we talk about reducing livestock production and increasing grain production to cover these things, we're in trouble already. Let's remember that. So I guess I want to walk through at the moment some of the points that people will bring up to say this is why we should change our food systems, and sort of just debunk a couple of them and support a couple of them. But I think number one is that the fact, as we talk about reducing livestock production in the context of a food insecure world, where are we going to produce the food that we're going to take off the table, right? We've got this nice big ocean area, which we're working on maximizing as much as we want. I found out last week that I'm not going to get to watch Deadliest Catch this season because the snow crab population has been decimated, and they're not going to be having a snow crab season this year. I'm not sure if anyone else is upset about that as I am, but we've got that. But what else do we have, right? We've got cultivable land, arable land. We know that that hasn't changed. We haven't found a good way to convert range land or into cultivable land. We can convert forest into arable land, but that's also not particularly well looked at. So we're left with this rangeland, right? This is how we improve the amount of food production that we can make without somehow magically making more cultivatable land. We've got this stuff called cellulose out there, right? The stuff that's in grasslands, in rangelands, the stuff that sheep are particularly good at utilizing. It's the most abundant energy source on the planet. Okay, let's get rid of that, right? See what happens to food security if you take ruminants, being the only animals that can use this stuff, take that off of the face of the planet, and food security will be a problem. So remember that in the context of that conversation. What we also have to remember, particularly for ruminants, and this is where ruminants really start to shine, is the fact that ruminants are able to utilize poor quality proteins, poor quality raw materials, and turn them into things that we can actually eat. Everyone will always say, they'll look at this figure, this is work from Alan Rotz at the USDA, is how much does it take, how many pounds of feed does it take to make a pound of live weight? Well, almost 14 in beef animals. They must be terrible. Why are we even doing this? We're destroying the environment. Well, okay, how much of that 13.8 pounds can we eat? Not very much. In fact, on average, 1.6 pounds of human edible protein goes into those animals to create 2.5 pounds of edible protein. Now, if you look through the data, broilers, who we look at as being one of the most efficient animals we have, pork, quite efficient, they're not making more protein than they're eating. Ruminant animals are the only animals on the planet that make more protein than they consume. From an edible protein standpoint, you can see almost 3 times more. In fact, I would suggest that if we put sheep onto this figure, we probably feed less human edible byproducts to sheep than we do other species. And in that case, you'll probably find that sheep, this number is even higher. That's pretty important, the ability of ruminant animals to upcycle protein as we are trying to feed a world that is insufficient in protein. This one by Anne Motet at the UN is essentially just another way of expressing that same data. So moving on to this question that you hear a lot of the time, right? Why don't we just stop feeding our feed to the animals, and then we will have more feed or more food to feed the human populations? And given what I just told you, you already know that that is a load of excrement from these guys. So this is actually comes out of the FAO, Anne Motet's work again here. And basically what they did is, from a global basis, they said, how much of our food are animals eating? And this is across livestock species, bearing in mind that poultry, so broiler poultry, eggs, pigs, all of the monogastric species that we feed as food animals have to eat food that is essentially suitable for monogastric species, right? That included in the calculations, 86% of the feed that goes to our global livestock is considered inedible by people. So no, they are not competing for human edible protein sources. And given what I just told you about ruminants upcycling inedible food into edible food, you know that this is a bad argument as well. Again, let's remember that. So I'm going to take a little bit of a detour, and forgive me if you guys have seen this quiz before. This I got from Frank Mitloehner out of UC Davis, and I thought that this was quite an interesting conversation. So talking about food processors versus food producers, but let's talk about processed food for a second. Two of the recipes or ingredient lists that I have up on the screen right now are the two main vegetable-based protein company manufacturers. So Impossible Beef, and I'll give you the name of the second one in a second. It slipped my mind. The third one is actually a particularly high-quality range of dog food that we sell in the US. And I wonder if anybody can pick out the difference between those recipes. So there it is, Beyond Meat on the left, Walkabout super premium dog food, Canine Exotics in the middle, and Impossible Beef on the right. And so I guess the point of the slide is just to be a little bit facetious, but the point that I'm trying to make is that these are essentially recipes, right? This has been built out of the ingredients that you can see on the screen from food that already exists in our food production systems. Now, when you have folks coming along that's saying that we need to replace our existing meat dependency with these plant-based alternatives, I have a bit of a problem with that because they are not producing food. And what's going to happen to us if we replace food production with food processing? We're going to run out of food. And that's an important concept to make. And whether that comes to alternative milks or alternative meats, we need to realize that that's not a conversation that we can have in the food security space. Because if you want to talk about Impossible Beef having a lower carbon footprint than actual beef, that's carbon footprint per unit of food produced, right? Not just in general. And their carbon footprint per unit of food produced is infinite because they're not producing food. So you divide by 0, the answer is infinity. The carbon footprint is essentially infinite with those products. But we need to, I guess, just be aware of those conversations that are happening and put them in a food security context. Because, again, the people that are starving and don't have adequate food intake are not going to be asking for Impossible burgers. Another one you hear is that we should shut down food production where we produce too much, right? You get that curve that right up at the top end, you've got a lot of excess food production, and why don't we just move that across the world? And that is a really good concept, and we should be better about moving excess food around the world. But shutting down food production in the places where it is most efficiently produced, let's say in North America, the best food production systems in the world. For example, this is the North American beef industry has 6% of the world's cattle, produces 18% of the world's beef. What's going to happen if we shut down that production? We don't need all that. Let's shut it down. People in Europe going to stop eating beef? People in China going to stop eating beef? Absolutely not. That production is just going to shift to somewhere else. And what's the chances that wherever that beef production shifts to is going to be more efficient than the way that we do it here right now? I don't need to answer that question for you because it's fairly obvious. The other piece that we also don't consider too much, and we don't do it, I'm not even talking mainstream society, we as agricultural scientists and community don't even think about some of the ecosystem services, as I call them, that our animals bring to the world. One of the big areas is in the ability of these animals to use things that we can't eat, right? And I mentioned that already. All the feeds that we can't eat actually end up entering our food supply because these animals process them. But what we haven't considered is the fact that what happens to all those crop residues, all these food byproducts of grain processing and everything else that we do, high fructose corn syrup production and all of that stuff. What happens to all that stuff if we don't have livestock to feed it to? That's really, really important because we're converting that to food right now. And if we don't do that, we lose food. But what else? So this was a really cool study that was done by actually my former mentor, Juan Tricarigo, and a couple of other people. But basically what they went in and did is said, what will happen to the byproducts if we don't feed them to cattle? And they did a whole survey of nutritionists and figured out how much byproducts all the dairy cattle eat, all this good stuff, and figured out that there's 70 grams of CO2 equivalents produced per kilogram of byproduct that we feed to cattle, right? So, man, we're feeding byproducts to cattle that's making greenhouse gases. That's a problem, right? We don't want to do that. We're destroying the world. Well, okay, we're not going to feed byproducts to the cattle. What are we going to do with them? A lot of people would say we need to compost them, because if we compost them, we're able to actually regather some of those nutrients, right? We get them bound into the compost, we feed them to plants, we retain some of the nutrients in the system. Problem is, composting those byproducts in the system will increase the amount of methane or greenhouse gases made by that same quantity of byproducts by 5x. Because obviously that stuff is fermenting in the compost pile and it's giving off methane. If you put that stuff right into a landfill, not only do you lose all of the nutrients that are inside of those byproducts, but the amount of greenhouse gases that come off of those byproducts and crop residues goes up 50 times what they would be if they were fed to a dairy cow in this place. So let's not just consider the direct effects of emissions from animals, right? I mean, this is the only thing that we and all the other groups are looking at is how much methane cows burp out, right? Let's consider what will happen if we actually stop doing that. Really important. And then again, we lose nutrients. So how do we do it? I know the topic of the conversation of this talk was talking about things that we can do on the ground, right? Things that we can do to improve our sustainability or carbon footprint right now. And the answer is maybe a bit disappointing or maybe a bit of a letdown, but we have to do what we've been doing. Everything that we do to increase the efficiency of production of livestock products is reducing our carbon footprint and has been reducing our carbon footprint. There may be some short-term incentivized programs to go in and directly inhibit methane or whatever it might be, but the things that we've been practicing for decades, following the science, improving efficiencies, have made dramatic impacts on the sustainability of livestock production and will continue to do so. Some of the specific things, though, I think that we're going to be looking at is certainly utilizing grasslands and byproducts and finding ways to balance the nutrition on those more effectively. Because as soon as a diet is out of balance, you're going to have something that you're feeding in excess. And when you're feeding something in excess, that doesn't end up being incorporated into the final product. That represents waste. So the more fine-tuned that we can get our supplementation programs on pastures, the better we're going to do. I think increased incorporation of raw materials into livestock instead of going to landfills is a huge thing. Correcting amino acid composition of feeds going into pigs and poultry, which we are very good at already, is a main one. And then I think particularly on pastured lands, understanding our effect on these ecosystem services, looking at carbon sequestration, I think is going to become quite important into the future. Because, and the reason why I say that we are already doing the right thing is, if you look at this work by Sarah Place, this is actually FAO data. And essentially what they did was looked at in this case, this is beef, and this is the global cattle meat greenhouse gas emissions in 2016. And the figure on the right, which is 45% lower in greenhouse gas emissions, is if developing nations achieve the developed nations' average emissions intensity. So the tools that we have developed to grow livestock are dramatically reducing livestock greenhouse gas impact. And we need to scale this, and we need to scale this globally if we want to take on the problem. In fact, this is a very, very recent study, and I received this from a close contact that I know very well. I'm trying to get the reference for this, and I will circulate the reference with your group so that we can get this one circulated. But essentially, this is a study that looked at the North American dairy industry since 2007 and the progress that they've made in some of these sustainability credentials as a result of technological advances in diet, hay, forage, production, and management. And compared to 2007, we need almost 1 million fewer cows to produce the same amount of milk. We save enough feed on efficiency to fill over 3,000 football stadiums worth of feed. We reduced land mass use by the equivalent of the state of Maryland. We have reduced greenhouse gas intensity to the extent that to produce the same milk, we produce less greenhouse gases to the equivalent of taking 4 million cars off of the road. And enough water saved to provide New York City with water for 2 years. This is since 2007. This is not since the 40s. So the rate of change and the rate of improvement in these systems is absolutely astronomical and something that we shouldn't walk away from and something we should all know about. But the elephant in the room is greenhouse gases, right? This is the one that anyone involved in ruminant science is being pinged with, is being given a hard time. If you sit next to someone on the plane and you tell them what they do, they immediately start asking about methane. So let's talk about that. This is the problem. These curves showing both carbon dioxide and methane in our environment going back 1 million years. We didn't have sensors 1 million years ago, but this stuff comes from ice core data. Shows that we do have a bit of a problem. Here's CO2. You can see that you can't even see the curve after 0 AD, but all you can see is that that line is going vertical. The concentrations of carbon dioxide in the environment are very unusual and as a consequence of our activities. The same goes for methane. The curve looks exactly the same. It's not quite as cyclical, but you can see that we've got a very unusual spike in methane as well. So that's why everyone's got their hands in the air, right? They're both greenhouse gases that warm the environment, so people are concerned about it, and they should be. What do they actually mean? So these are data that have nothing to do with agriculture, they have nothing to do with any industry. These are from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration website in the US, government website showing radiative forcing. In other words, the concentration of gases that are in our atmosphere are contributing this much towards warming, and the sources of each gas for that warming. And as you can see, and won't be surprised, CO2 and methane are two of the most important ones. Really important to look at is the slope of those lines, right? Methane is relatively flat slope, and as Prof. Mitloehner will tell us, if we continue to make the same amount of methane every day, and it gets broken down at a fixed rate, the level of methane in the environment will remain relatively constant. That's kind of what we're seeing. We know it is increasing because that curve was pretty high, but relative to CO2, this curve looks pretty flat. What I did is I went and I zeroed out this data set at 1979 at zero, just to look at what has been causing warming since 1979. And it is no secret in this curve what is causing the majority of the warming. And last I checked, ruminant animals are not putting CO2 out into the environment. That's important, right? We are not causing global warming. But this was published this week. This is the Journal of Nature Sustainability, extremely high impact publication, the environmental footprint of global food production. And they break down every type of food in every region and say, this is your footprint that you have. Below that, I've got a couple of taglines from the Washington Post's evaluation of that paper. Here's exactly how much your diet affects the planet. Pigs and cattle rank as the top environmental offenders, and the cattle because of greenhouse gases, and the pigs because of water use. Now, this is a very prestigious journal. There is not an animal scientist or an agronomist or an agricultural scientist of any sort in the author list. The greenhouse gases that they're reporting are using the outdated GWP 100 system that uses methane as if it was a permanent environmental gas. They're only reporting emissions. So last I checked is our production systems exist within an ecosystem, right? We have carbon flowing from the air into plants through cattle and back into the air. It's a system. You have to measure both what goes in and what comes out of that system. They're only measuring what comes out. I think it's really important that we look at water retention as well, but I'm going to keep that out of this discussion. They don't account for the fact that pastures sequester carbon and hold carbon, right? And this whole story about preventing greenhouse gas residues from byproducts entering the atmosphere is something we really need to focus on as well. But they're not talking about that. They're treating agricultural emissions as if they are fossil fuel emissions, right? Pull coal out of the ground, burn it, it goes into the air. Simple. We don't deal with simple systems like that. In fact, this is one of our research partners. It's called Archibald Expeditions. It is an ecology research station that exists on a working cattle ranch in Florida. And some of their early estimates of their emissions were actually relatively high, and they produced almost 11,000 metric tons. This is 3,000 cow herd in Florida. 10,000, 11,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year. However, the estimates of sequestration ability of those pastures is almost 18,000 tons of carbon. So actually, this beef production system is a net sequestrant of carbon. These were early estimates. These were estimates, model-generated estimates. We've now gone back in and actually measured it, and measured it over time. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? Let me just walk you through these figures here real quick. And this is on the left-hand side, we've got greenhouse gas emissions from the ecosystem. In other words, the cattle plus the pasture that they're on. And you can see the emissions on the grazed pastures are actually pretty high. Sequestration is this bottom line at the bottom that's dipping down here. That's how much carbon is being sequestered by the pasture. And this middle line is essentially the difference between those two. It's called net ecosystem exchange. In other words, how much carbon is moving either from the ecosystem to the air or from the air into the ecosystem. And you can see that at different times of year, that cycles up and down from emissions to sequestration, which is pretty cool. What's really, really interesting is they had plots of land that they took out the impact of grazing animals. You can see that the ecosystem still produces methane, not as much as when it has cattle on it, not surprisingly. But all of a sudden, you've got net sequestration during a good part of the year when cattle are on the land, and when cattle are not on the land, you've got net emission. You've got a greener system with cattle on it on a pasture than if you left the system as it was. And honestly, that shouldn't be surprising to us, given that most of these ecosystems evolved under the pressure of grazing ruminants. This is really important. When we're talking about emissions all of the time, when we talk about agriculture, we are selling ourselves short because we have a huge story to tell. We are the only industry that exists at the interface between carbon dioxide and carbon fixation. Our job is to take carbon out of the air and put it into food. And I think we can extend that to taking carbon out of the air and putting it into the soil, because the scale of sequestration is massive. This is actually a meta-analysis that was conducted by a group that is not particularly friendly to agriculture. You can read this meta-analysis was done in 2021, and they looked at what essentially could be done to improve the environmental metrics of beef production in this case, or ruminant livestock production. They found that different technological interventions and growth efficiency strategies, we could only expect to reduce greenhouse gases by around 8%, but that manipulating of carbon sequestration management on grazed lands could reduce greenhouse gases by a net of 46%. We've really got to be looking at this. The problem that we have as an industry standpoint is very, very difficult to measure on farm, right? We need a metric that is allowing us to measure this stuff on farm. But just because we can't measure it at this time accurately doesn't mean we should ignore it. We need to be highlighting this every opportunity we get as a very important part of the story that we don't have the answers to yet. So I facetiously ask, but I also think that this may well be in our future as folks that work with grazing ruminants, is that what does the future of our industry look like? Will we be looking at sequestration as a byproduct of food production, or food production as a byproduct of sequestration? Because this is going to become really, really important as those CO2 levels rise and we start seeing administrations getting involved in this. And I think we, as I said, we in agri-food production and forestry are essentially the only industries that have carbon capture at their core. So I think that essentially we're going from having the most important job in the world, which is feeding the world. I think that's primary in any conversation that we have to have. But I think we're going into an era where we're going to be having one of the, or two of the most important jobs in the world. And that's both feeding the world and being the only ones responsible for being able to reverse climate change, even though we are not the causative agent in that story. We need to stop thinking of ourselves as a martyr in that case and just say, we're the people, we're the only people who can do something about it, and we are going to do something about it as a result. So try to ignore the negative press. I know it's very, very difficult, but I think we have, in general, a very, very positive message to say within agriculture. We've got to stick to our message, and the science is on our side. And I believe that it will win out at the end. So I'm pretty sure I'm a little over, but I can get carried away on this topic. So I'd be very happy to try and take any questions if there's time.
Thank you, Dr. Holder. At this time, we do have enough time. We could take a couple of questions from the floor.
I look very surprised in that picture. I think I was talking about the same stuff there, actually.